Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Solari Report. We have an immense treat for you today. Alastair Crooke is, as you know from listening to Money and Markets or listening to our coverage, is my number one go-to source for what in the world is going on in the Middle East and the world. And Alastair, I think I've listened to every interview you've done in the last year. I can't thank you enough for your work. As soon as something happens, you jump on, and some of the most important insights we've had at the Solari Report have on what's happening have come from you. And I should just introduce you. We all know who you are, of course, but you had a very long and distinguished career both in the British intelligence services and diplomatic corps, and then literally moved to a process of helping people in a variety of ways understand what's going on in the world in the Middle East. You have a wonderful Substack called Conflicts Forum, which we hang out at regularly. I can't recommend enough. And you're very generous with your interviews. And is there anything else you want me to say about your background other than I think you know how to embrace the real complexity of the world we live in, and that's one of the things I so appreciate about you.
No, that's more than generous. So I have nothing to add to that. Thank you so much for what you said.
Okay, so one of the challenges of looking at the unwinding of the U.S.-China economic and trade relationship is trying to understand the proxy wars, whether in the Ukraine or the Middle East, but what is the goal? And I've been watching now your coverage of the Iran war. And my question to you is, what is the United States goal? And I shouldn't even say the United States. What is the oligarchs and the dollar syndicates' goal with what is happening in the Middle East?
With what's happening in the Middle East, I think if we look at the big picture, which is, I think, what you and your viewers are most interested in, is it came down to the security statement, the national security statement that was issued a little time ago in the United States, seemingly authored mainly by Colby Eldridge. And he wrote a book earlier about it. And he set out really what I think is very clearly Americans' aims. And he said, we have to coerce China into exporting less and consuming more domestically. They have to increase their consumption at home. In other words, in order to leave us more space in order to be able to export into the global market. And he said there are two ways really of doing this. He said this is the objective to do this. One is trade restrictions. Trade war is one way of doing this. And the second thing he said was really to squeeze their energy supply line. In that way, we can pressure them. So we've seen this. Across the board, this has become a very obvious factor. It is squeezing it through all, if you like, the navigable waterways, through the choke points, through all the accesses for China. So we saw this in Venezuela. We've seen it in Cuba taking place. We see it in the attempt in Hormuz to blockade the Hormuz was partly intended. It hasn't worked, but it was intended also to squeeze China's supply line. In fact, people overstate the amount of dependence China is on supply lines of oil from Hormuz. It's only 7% of Chinese total because they consume so much energy. Even though it's 40% of the total oil exported from Hormuz, it's only 7% of Chinese energy requirement, and mostly for their teapots, for their refinery teapots. And so all of this has been an attempt to get control of the energy generally and control energy in the global sense, but control it principally through the choke points, through, if you like, all of the navigable waterways and areas. And it's a double-ended one because it's trying to cut back Chinese energy supplies, but also to stop Russian supplies. So we've entered what I call a period of tanker war, because we've seen this a lot. I mean, there's tanker war taking place off the Persian Gulf, but we saw it off Venezuela. But we've also seen it, and it's been, I think, less visible in the rest of the world, but the tanker war against Russia. For example, Britain is trying to stop tankers sailing through the English Channel. France has been seizing Russian so-called sanctioned tankers. Tankers have been actually struck and hit, Russian tankers, in the Mediterranean, or at least at the mouth of the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. So we are in, and we've had a tanker war before, when this was more an Israeli tanker war, where they tried to stop, if you like, Russian tankers arriving, and it didn't work very well. It was against Iranian tankers and others, and it didn't work very well because it was tit for tat, and of course it failed because okay. But it's an all lose game, because if one side starts attacking tankers, then there will be retribution against their tankers, and that can hurt even the United States, which proclaims its energy self-sufficiency. It's still dependent on the flow of energy, because energy is a fungible thing. And that if energy is in short supply in the Middle East or in Europe, of course it affects the price of energy, because it isn't such a diverse and compartmented market as that. It will affect it. So yes, we are seeing that, and that I think is the purpose to do it. However, already it's had an important reaction. China announced a few days ago, I can't remember exactly which day, it wasn't announced, it was a big public platform, but quietly they said all of those restrictions that Treasury Secretary Bessent had imposed, sanctioning, if you like, 5 refiners in China, not only the main 5 refiners who used Iranian oil, but also the banks and any commercial institute that was engaged in this. They made it illegal under a Limitations Act, which dates back to 2021, so that it is illegal for any Chinese to facilitate American sanctions on these 5 refiners, or on the banks, or on the financial institutions that may be in receipt of Iranian funds. So they said it is now illegal for you to cooperate with America on these sanctions. This is really the first time that China has got so openly engaged in defying sanctions. Largely, China has been surprisingly cooperative, I would say, on many sanctions. And they've added to it, because a few days before that, you may recall that the Panama Canal has 2 ports on it, which formerly were owned by Hong Kong entity, private entity, and they were effectively expropriated by US interests. And China has also said, well, passage through the Panama Canal henceforth will be denied any entry to Chinese ports. Those that are using the Panama Canal will not be permitted and will be subject to particular inspection before as they try and arrive in China, but they will not have access. So they've sort of blacklisted any vessels passing through the Panama Canal they won't be received in China. So they've made these two quite tough, if you like, acts in response to Besant's attempt to sanction Chinese banks and Chinese oil companies trading with Iran. Just to add to this, I would say, in fact, China is not being squeezed, as people see, by what's happening in Hormuz, because day after day, large Chinese tankers, day before yesterday, if I remember correctly, one very large tanker passed through Hormuz through the Iranian processing for China. And this has been going on every day. Chinese vessels have been passing with Iranian facilitation to China. So have some other vessels from Pakistan and from India, and I think even from Malaysia have been passing through, paying a fee, complying with the protocols to prove that their cargoes were paid for in yuan and not in dollars, and the protocols of which passage they used between Qasim Island and Larak Island in order to exit from Hormuz.
We just saw sort of new negotiations with Indonesia on the Straits of Malacca. Do you think that the U.S. is going to try and squeeze on the Straits of Malacca as well?
I think so, eventually. I don't think this is sort of on the immediate agenda, but yes, I think this is part of the whole pattern that was set in the national security statement, the squeezing of China, because the trade war is not going well the attempt to squeeze China by the trade restrictions, as you know, has not been a success. So there's more emphasis on this, and also on the inner ring of islands around China. There's a buildup of American military activity on that, the first ring of islands adjacent to China, as if it's preparatory to some sort of siege, ultimately being a blockade being attempted on China itself. I think we're not close to that at the moment, but I think if you ask me what's in the mind, I would say that all of these steps are leading to that idea that ultimately not just Venezuela, but China itself might be blockaded down the process.
That's so extraordinary to think of. One thing that I keep pointing out is in 2023, the yield on the 10-year Chinese sovereign bond dropped through the U.S. yield. And if you look at what's been happening in the market recently, the 10 and 30-year U.S. bond the yields are really rising. And in a way that I don't think necessarily a new Fed governor can bring down. So if anything, it says to me that the financial war that the U.S. is hoping to win is not necessarily going in the right way. Would you agree with that?
Oh, completely. Apart from those measures, China, is really innovating. They don't make a big noise about it, but they do it very quietly, and they're innovating in many ways. So yes, it's cheaper to borrow from China, much cheaper than buying in the US dollar market now. Mm-hmm. And so we have even European countries in the EU issuing panda bonds, issuing borrowing in the yuan market for European states. That's Hungary and Slovenia are both issuing their bonds not in treasuries, but in yuan-denominated debt. And we've seen also even banks like Deutsche Banks are now giving a debt in yuan if you want to borrow. And the Chinese have made this much easier with a number of small measures that they've introduced. For example, for holders of digital yuan, which appeals to people, particularly in the Middle East and things, because they're sort of gray. You can't follow them so easily. But they've given an order that banks pay interest on holdings of digital yuan, so that it's almost like a checking account. I mean, savings account. You get interest on your money, and it's quite appealing, therefore. And they've introduced all sorts of other innovations quietly, like such as on the Shanghai gold exchange, metal exchange. They've introduced, and not only can you can buy outside the Chinese gold, outside of the Chinese, if you like, capital restrictions areas in Hong Kong or in Shanghai interchangeably. But the Chinese are issuing warrants. Not that you have to actually have the physical bullion, but you can have warrants on gold and use them, if you like, as a treasury. I mean, as a security asset. And you can have these, and then you can cash them in, and you could take physical gold if you want to, or you can exchange it for something else. So a whole lot of those things are happening. And Lavrov just the other day said that the new rules that they introduced for trading exchange, for clearing trade accounts between states, they're expanding not just to BRICS but to everybody. So they're going to use the Chinese, if you like, technology that was first trialed by BIS, the L Bridge system. They've just now BIS stopped that experiment, and the Chinese reintroduced it using entirely their own currency.
So when the BIS moved out of the Enbridge system, they titularly left the UAE in their position, and that's very interesting to me because the UAE is now trying to negotiate with Treasury, but I believe the Fed, to get a swap line. And the negotiation is, if you give us a swap line, then we won't sell our treasuries in U.S. stocks to raise capital. So that brings us to the Gulf Financial Center. We've seen an enormous growth of the Gulf Financial Center on the premise that they had a U.S. security blanket. That U.S. security blanket seems to have gotten the rug pulled out from under it. What does that mean to the Gulf as a financial center going forward?
Well, I'll come to that, but I just want to go back very briefly. But what happened was the BIS experiment was cancelled by the United States on the eve of the BRICS summit. It was not going to be allowed. So the Chinese took it over. They were anyway, it was their technology. And that's what is being used, and that's what Lavrov is decided will extend to many other countries in the region and make it available to them. What you saw with the UAE in this case is a direct quid pro quo process. The events, just to update your viewers on what really has happened in these last few days in terms of the Hormuz and the Operation Freedom. What was happening was that the UAE, together with the United States, was trying to coordinate a mass vessel surge through the Hormuz to break the blockade with some not very serious semblance of American military support. So the UAE was slowly, quietly moving its vessels closer and closer to the Omani side of the entrance to the Hormuz Strait in an attempt to make a dash through with many vessels and say it's open and we've done it. Freedom, it's been opened. And the Iranians saw that these vessels were sort of grouping and preparing for this. And it instructed the vessels in no uncertain terms to move away and move back to Dubai port and keep out of the way. Most did that because, their owners and their insurance companies did not want to take the risk of going through against the advice of the IRGC. However, one tanker, a UAE tanker, tried to go through and was attacked and was badly damaged, set on fire by the IRGC, and the whole thing collapsed. The idea of sort of surging through of Operation Freedom, it effectively collapsed, and the consequence was an expansion by Iran of its restricted area, right up including Fujairah. Fujairah is a port outside. It's actually in the UAE. It's a funny little extra part of the UAE that is outside of the Hormuz, and they have a sort of oil loading base there and pipeline to it. And that was destroyed in the aftermath of these events, set on fire. So UAE now has no, if you like, ability to sell oil directly by passing the Hormuz into the Persian Gulf. So that was the end. That's why suddenly we all heard there were other elements to it, which I need to go into because of your question. But there were other elements in this too, in that there is a major split between the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and Qatar and the other elements. UAE is acting to support, very closely working with Israel in order to try and break the siege in Hormuz, and is in favor of further conflict with Iran. They've made that very clear, and they say they are prepared to cooperate with Israel and the United States in an attack. Saudi Arabia refused to go down that, and they were very angry at this attempt to try and break the siege by forcing. I mean, the American support was so limited, it amounted actually to telling these vessels, look, take the risk and try and stay as close to the Omani coast as you can and see if you make it. That was the extent of the support they got. So not surprisingly, I mean, it wasn't going to work. I mean, this was never going, it was a crazy, crazy system. That was all it was. But the result has been very important. Saudi Arabia shut the use of its Prince Sultan Air Base to America. Shut its airspace to the United States altogether.
Wow.
And
Right.
so did Kuwait. So did Kuwait. They both of those states said, sorry, we are with Pakistan on this. And so we had a complete split between the UAE working ever more closely with Israel and the United States. I think I haven't got direct evidence, but it seems to me very likely this was the UAE's suggestion. Let's get all these vessels together. We'll coordinate. It was certainly coordinated by UAE with the United States. We'll coordinate a mass breaking of Hormuz, and not surprisingly collapsed because it was such a crazy idea.
How does that relate to their dropping out of OPEC at the same time?
Okay, and I just answer your first question just for completeness. I mean, the UAE is suffering a huge dollar shortage. And if you like, I mean, 450 hotels there have shut down. There are no tourists in anything
Right.
resembling the numbers before. They are not exporting their oil, and they're suffering a big dollar shortage. Even the food has to come through Hormuz for the UAE. It's that serious that all their imports has to go through it. So they said to the United States, you've got to support us. You have to support us with a dollar swap. Otherwise we'll have to start selling treasuries and buying yuan to be able to sort of pay for the food and the things that we need through the, from whatever means we can get them. So, you've got to help us with that. And so that was the quid pro quo. Okay, we want some dollars. You've got to give us a lot of dollars, whether it was actually lending the money or giving it an actual swap, I don't know. But that was it. They were saying, we're taking a lead, we're out there, we're exposed, we're naked. You've got to support us with dollars because we're running out and we're in financial trouble. And it underlines also how Saudi Arabia is taking a very different view. And I think what this means, in a sort of longer perspective, is that aside from the UAE, the states, most of the Gulf states, but also led in part by Pakistan, but with China in the background, are sort of moving towards a new security architecture for the whole region, for the Gulf region. And you recall it was China who first, brought Iran and Saudi Arabia together in a meeting a few years ago, which was the first rapprochement. And I suspect, as you know, Arachi, the foreign minister of Iran, has just been in Beijing and has just come back from Beijing. He didn't stop, by the way, in Islamabad, as some people are reporting. He went straight back to Tehran. He had talks in China. And he came there from having had talks in Moscow in St. Petersburg with Putin. So I think a new security architecture is coming into being. Now, my prediction, but it's personal more than I can give you chapter and verse, it will not be possible to do that with full American participation in that security, with any American participation in that security. It's got to be a Gulf security architecture, perhaps supported by China and Russia. But it has got to be, because it's not going to be possible to have a security architecture that envisages American bases in the region again. It's the American bases, I think it's been now reported I think it was in the New York Times, showed how damaged the bases. 13 bases are pretty well finished. They're over. It would cost billions to repair them. Even to put the radar back in Qatar, in the Al Udeid base there, it would cost something $1 billion and would take 5 years to reconstruct. So I don't think it's going to happen. I think we're going to see a geopolitical shift in the Middle East towards a new security architecture. I think it's going to be led partly by Saudi Arabia and with Russia in supporting. Its skeleton has been there for some time, because you've seen there have been joint naval exercises, China, Russia, taking place for some time in the Gulf with Iran and India too. And I think we're going to see a security architecture take place, which doesn't mean it's hostile to the United States, but it will just be without the United States direct involvement. As I say, it will not be intended to be in opposition or antagonistic, but it would prefer to have a security architecture that has no American direct security involvement.
And who do you think will lead that in the Gulf? Will it be Saudi?
Yes, Saudi.
Yeah.
Saudi and
Saudi.
Qatar is moving that way too, and Oman. Oman, of course, has a sort of very close relationship both with Iran and with Russia. And I think the Russians are playing an important part in this too. And I think this is the second reason why I don't think, why Operation Freedom suddenly stopped and collapsed, because the Chinese said something very fierce, very strong to Trump. It was hidden in the statement of Ambassador Fu, who's now head of the UN Security Council. He's president of the Security Council. It's a rotating thing, and from 1st of May, China is president of the Security Council. He gave a speech at the Security Council, and he said effectively, now this is my words, but this is my paraphrase of it. Mr. Trump, the road to Beijing passes through Hormuz. If you do not settle the Hormuz issue, were this visit to go ahead, he put in brackets, and it was rather deeper inside the thing. It said, were your visit to go ahead, you may expect the question of the illegitimate war with Iran will be the main topic, the top of the agenda when you arrive in Beijing. And that was a very tough statement to Mr. Trump. And I think that if we are in a hiatus, I don't know for sure, but if we're in a hiatus, part of that is because I think President Trump is considering, that the time till he goes to China is now days. It's next Friday.
Right.
So, I mean, has he got time to do another round of war with Iran? I mean, and have it concluded before he goes to China? I mean, that's a question. I don't have an answer to that, because he still said, and this is where you can never predict, because he said in his statement yesterday, Iran has 48 hours to agree to what they've already agreed. So as if, if they've already agreed those points that America made and were reported by Axios, and of course, they're nonsense. They were never agreed by Iran, and Iran has said, no way, we completely reject those. We have made our points. That was the 12-point plan that they gave to the United States and said, that's what we are prepared to negotiate. And Trump at the time said that seems a reasonable basis for negotiation, but now says it's not acceptable. So, time is getting short, I think. So
Right.
will he take some military action before going? It's possible, but my feeling is time is so short. And it's so important, the visit, for him. I mean, China and trade, and that the financial aspect. And as you rightly said, the financial relationship with China, China has the cards, knows it has the cards, and it is not going to be easy for America to play against their hand.
So if you look at the imports from China in 2022, China was the number one import source with, say, 537 billion. Today, it's dropped. If you just look January, February, it's 50% of what it was in January, February of 2022 area. So it's, I always say that fighting with China is like Siamese twins fighting. And so if you look at the drop in imports, China's gone from being number one to number three, Mexico and Canada now number one and number two, but it's still, $350+ billion. It's extraordinary interdependency. And
yes.
And so, yeah.
But they've been cutting it every month.
Yeah.
They've been reducing the exports to the United States at the same time that the global exports have been surging. Yes, right. To Asia, to the European Union, they've gone up by about 13%. At the same time, they have dropped by many percent to the United States. So the Chinese have moved more firmly towards a sort of self-sufficiency stance. And partly this is the result of the trade war, because they've learned, they watched what's happened to Russia, and they saw the sanctioning of Russia, and they saw that the only answer to being sanctioned in the way Russia was, from that period when the assets were frozen, from that period onwards, China has decided to move much more towards self-sufficiency. So they do depend on America for some things like aircraft and so on, but it is much less. And they are much less dependent generally on oil. They've been making massive changes in their sort of take-up of other forms of energy sources. And I just point out, because I was in China in December, and I was astonished. I was talking to some industrialist. He owns many factories in China, not just a few. He's a big economic player, very clever, very bright. And he said very clearly, first of all, we have played AI much more cleverly than you in the West, right? Much more cleverly. We've used it at the factory floor. It was a sort of simple AI that is closer to automation and robotics and, big data AI. But he said, look, I have all these factories. Take one, for example. If last year I employed 2,000 men, at the beginning of this year, now it's down to 200. And my prices and the competitiveness has dropped. Overall, our price level for manufacturing goods is dropped 2%. And I said, oh my God, when you say that, we are in real trouble, because this is, we're reaching that point of when two nations are sort of trying to deal with each other. And he said, look, you just have to understand, a gigabyte of electricity in China for AI or for other technological things is 1/6 of the price in the United States. And I said, but that means we'd have to see the dollar devalued by about 140% to equal that up. And he said, yes, this is one of those moments that need to be managed very carefully, in my view. And that's what I told him. This is, this is a challenge to the United States and to Europe. We're just not competitive with what you have just done in this period. And we have to deal with this in a very mature way, because, this is one of those, I forget the term, but, when one state is moving ahead and one changing their periods, that particular moment. But we're in that moment, and we need to be very careful of that. So China is sort of moving that way, but not it's definitely trying not to be very disruptive. So all these little things I'm saying are sort of introduced, low-key, put out there. China is not trying to induce a market collapse. It's not in their interest. They don't want that. They want something, but they want it to be understood, that China is in a position where it needs to be taken seriously and not just be the subject of sort of endless propaganda, which is, most of it is baseless, and to find a way of finding some sort of harmony back into their favorite word, back into into political relations.
So my guess is that the big footprint data centers are very much designed in the United States to implement programmable money and control. Because if trade wars are not going to solve the imbalance problem, and we've had 50 years of buying popular support in the United States with fiscal largesse, the way to change that is with financial repression, and that requires enormous amounts of data. We're looking at the US struggling to move off of its model, and of course, it's going the wrong way. And you're right. If you look at the AI in the United States, it's not being primarily engineered to produce productivity. It's being engineered to keep the stock market levitated and the population under control.
Absolutely. And this is what, I mean, I was there at a time there was a big AI conference taking place in Beijing when I was there with Huawei and all these experts. And I'm not a technical expert, but the message, and this is what this man said to me, and he said, look, your AI in the West is going to crash and burn. Because the cost, the capital cost, the capex is unimaginable on this.
Right.
And there's not going to be the revenues to support it. It's not
Right.
going
And
to
there's
be
not the energy.
Not
We
the
don't have-
energy.
Right. We don't have the
Not the
energy.
energy. That's when he mentioned, we have energy at 1/6 of the price if you can get it in the West. But we have it at 1/6 of the price, but we're not in that game of trying to do that. We are trying to do a very factory floor structure of AI, that we make ourselves competitive, and it's all about productivity. And you don't have the manufacturing to do that anyway. I mean, I'm talking about Europe as well as America. You just don't, we're not geared to that. We're not in Europe, not at all geared to that. And he said, so what you have, and he said, of course, your AI was basically derived from military appropriations, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, trying to impute intent to people. And that's what's attracted government. How do we impute intent of people to be in opposition to us? We want that so that we can control things much better, control the money and control them. And it is really a very repressive. It is not only just a repressive, but it's more than that. It is a deeply sinister approach, which is about controlling, and also in Europe, and I'm talking because I see it. I've got children who are leaving school and things like that. I mean, it's going to decimate in Europe the middle class jobs, and so where's going to be all this extra consumption coming from if the middle class are decimated? Because the other 80% below them are already decimated and can barely sort of survive. So we have this huge structural, if you like, imbalance, huge structural contradictions in our economies. And so the Chinese are saying, well, I mean, what they're going to do is going to be, I mean, further on, it's not going to be deliberate, but quite clearly AI is going to go, in Europe anyway, open source. And we're not going to have a reliance and paying huge rents to Microsoft and Amazon, because we'll be able to get it through some source on our ordinary laptops and do, homemade AI. And so that whole project will collapse. But in the process, it will take down many jobs in lawyer firms and in other areas. It will take down a lot of jobs. It already is taking down many jobs in Europe. So this is why saying, this thing, I'm sure China will be blamed, but actually they have done nothing to really rock the boat. I mean, what they've done in terms of those, if you like, teapot refineries and saying anyone who, exceeds to Chinese. I mean, this is part of the negotiations with Trump when it comes. They're putting some, they're getting leverage for these negotiations. It's not an attempt to bring down the American economy, but it is an attempt to say to Americans, you have to think very seriously about whether your objectives are possible. Can you win this war like this?
So the U.S. has had a model where it can use the subsidy coming from the dollar reserve system to, as you said, do the things you're describing in a way that dramatically reduces productivity, and you use more and more capital force or more and more military force. And traditionally, the way they've won the kind of war that they're in the Ukraine and Iran, they don't need to win it. They just need to outspend for longer in a way that drains the competition. And the problem is that depends on being able to amass this incredible amount of capital. And if you look at what's happening in the U.S. bond market, the bond market's signaling maybe you're not going to get away with it this time.
They're not going to get away with it because something has completely changed it. And what has changed it is asymmetrical war.
Right.
And if you like, trench warfare has turned into technical trench warfare. I mean, drones and other elements. And so you have, Iran producing missiles for $500 up against missiles of the United States at $40 million.
Right.
It's the ability, the old way of war of America of outspending its rivals, which it did in the case of Russia, and therefore which it sought to repeat, has just been destroyed in Iran. And I think what we will see also is that, and this is my prediction, that the Russians have been very much interested in the Iran war and are looking to their changing, perhaps looking, it's a debate that's ongoing, but looking to change their posture in terms of the lessons learned from the asymmetrical war, that the future of that is that they don't have to outspend the United States again. The trouble is America outspends itself in these wars, but they don't have to outspend it. So this is a huge strategic, if you like, I think, shift taking place in the way in which America thinks about war, and the old way of thinking, the old way of fighting a war with expensive aircraft, expensive ships, expensive everything, against states like Iran, which have done it on a fraction of the price, changes this because the technology is there. You take apart a Russian drone, and you'll find bits of open source technology from China, from Europe, and they've reassembled it. Sometimes it starts off in a garage and ends up being taken on by the Russian state and becoming a real project. But this is the change that's taken place.
It's interesting. I was at a briefing in 1989 in the Secretary of Defense's dining room. He was giving a briefing for the big industrialists on the budget that year. And there was a young entrepreneur who was very software savvy and understood what was coming with drones, and tried to warn them all that that the footprint was going to change dramatically, as you've just described. And everybody at the table froze because they clearly, what they were thinking, you could see the bubble over the head, is he doesn't understand the goal here is to keep the stock market up. It's not to have an economic military.
Precisely. Yeah, of course.
Okay, so several other things I want to ask you about. There was a magical moment. I think one of the most um, important things I've ever seen in discussions this year was at the end of your interview with Tucker Carlson, which was excellent. You talked about the possibility of America finally having to change its economic model. And in fact, when the interview was over, Tucker then added a section where he said, I want you to go back and listen to what Alastair said again, because this is so important. So maybe if you could just describe, I don't know if you remember that moment in the interview, but if you could describe what you said, because I thought, this is what has to happen. And you described it very, very elegantly.
Well, what I was trying to say is that we are really at a hinge moment because the contradictions in our economic systems have become so great that there is no political answer to them. In what I mean is that our economies have been turned towards a financialization, insider trading structure, whereby you make money, or you can make money in half an hour on having an insider information on the market. We've seen this happening just yesterday with the futures in the oil market, 900 million being shorted on the markets, much more easily than in making anything on the real market, real economy. The real economy has been ignored, and it's the real economy that provides jobs to people, provides security, provides, if you like, a well-being, ability, people to be able to afford housing, to be able to afford medical insurance, all these things. That sector, that 80%, has been sinking and sinking. I live in Italy, and since Italy joined the euro, I think it was 96, I may be wrong on the date exactly, there has been no increase in real wages since 96. And, people keep saying, the money runs out by week 3 in a month. We've run out of cash. But the real problem here is the fact that here just take example in Europe, but it's more widely, there's no answer. There's no political bridge out of this. All the European Union has carefully created centrist parties, putting together little bits of this and that and calling them a centrist party which obeys Brussels autocracy. And so, for the young people who are becoming more and more frustrated, what's the alternative? You vote, and you vote for Tweedledum or Tweedledee. You get the same, whichever you vote for. If you protest, you are met by these new high-powered water cannon and special noise mechanisms to defeat you mentally. I mean, they're vicious. At one point recently, France put something like 50,000 CRS, the anti-riot people on the street, against protesters. 50,000, I mean, this is an army, army against the people in this way. So if voting doesn't work, there's no path to a political bridge out of the dilemma that people are in, and protest is ignored, then the only thing you can do is you can turn to one form or another of revolution. And that this is coming, I believe, in Europe, because the structural contradictions, and that the structural contradictions are not just economic, but they're also a structural contradiction which is eliminating the element of what it is to be human. It's a direct, and when you talked about, what the tech brothers are planning for, if you like, controlling the economy and controlling the state, this is what we're talking about. It's anti-civilizational. It's about rendering a person, disembedding them from the idea of sovereignty, of being part of a nation, of being part of a church, of being part of a family, taking them and stripping them of all that and becoming units, and units that can be compelled by digital means or other means to keep this whole machine that provides more and more wealth to a smaller and smaller proportion. And this will blow up, I think, at some point in our faces. And what I said at the end of Tucker was that, yes, what I'm saying is quite dark, but I'm quite positive about it, because in the sense that I think we have been in the grips of a nihilism in Europe, a postmodernism, a postmodern nihilism, where everything, is negative and pushing us, and that has destroyed any sort of civilizational energy, civilizational strength. And the consequences of that is that we have to go through catharsis, constructive destruction. We have to accept we're going to have a tough time. It's going to be unpleasant. It may be economically very unpleasant, because that's what's going to happen anyway, probably. But we have to try and then find the green shoots and tend the green shoots that are going to allow us to sort of find the upward, if you like, impulses of civilization again. European civilization, American civilization.
So one of the things that we've spent many years focused on is what is that pathway through, to civilization and preserving the best of Western civilization. And we've started a program called Young Builders, which is the basis of extraordinary optimism on my part and the Solari team, because what we've discovered is that there's this started, Alastair, because our subscribers said, I don't want to send my children to these schools where they waste, tremendous amounts of money and time learning what they need to know to be successful. Can you create something? And so we did a first class, not knowing, the goal was to prove to ourselves that we could use our work and knowledge to significantly improve their chances of succeeding in this world, whether it's building families or building businesses. And after the first course, which is just coming to a close, we're convinced, or it's coming to a close in the fall, that this can work. And so we're taking applications for a second course. We're going to have a wonderful event in Italy, and I'm hoping I finally get to meet you in person. I'm very much looking forward to that.
Indeed.
But what I found is that these young people, you have a portion of young people who are ready to face and take on that catharsis. And they have the skills and the training to do it. They really can lead us through. And so we're very focused on getting behind them and helping that. But maybe if you could say a few things about, because I know you speak to young people, where you think that pathway is. If we want to lead through this catharsis, how do we find that pathway?
I think the first stage is basically to understand that this may not be sort of a very welcome thing to say, but to say we are already in this war. I mean, this is something of a civil war that is underway, and that there are forces engaged in this, and it reflects a contradiction, deep structural contradiction that is both, if you like, at a metaphysical level, at a level of morality, at a level of ethics, as well as at the economic level, and that we have really to understand that there is a real attempt to, if you like, to destroy the basis of what it is to be human, what it means to be human. That element which is deeply tied up with civilization, of course, with, in many cases, for many people, with their religion or their religious beliefs. But the most important thing is to get back the energy, that a civilization has energy and has excitement and about it. And one of the most important things that I've seen in this last period, and it's not well understood, but watching what's been happening in Iran. Iran of a month ago no longer exists. There is a new Iran, particularly amongst the young, and at the leadership too. And they know they're going to go through a hard time. But there is real excitement and energy and palpable energy amongst the young. Every night they are out on the street, waving flags, talking about how to reignite, the values of the revolution. The values of the revolution, which were about the struggle, the fight against oppression, against repression, the struggle for taking care of the community and the dispossessed, the struggle, if you like, to put values back into, to reinforce the narratives of myth and story, which underpin the moral, if you like, the moral architecture of a society. That it can't just be the sort of the selfish gene, as Ayn Rand was talking about. It has to be something of that you are ready to a certain extent to sacrifice yourself in the interests of a people or a community or your idea of what you stand for. What is the vision of Iran for the future? And that's something that they're talking about. And I was in Iran just before the first war, if you like, a few months ago. And this was, the main talk was, how do you get those values to, if you like, bring them into the future for young people today in this technological world? It's not, 79. It's a new world. Technology is here. How do young people today, if you like, feel those values, and how do we express them and take them forward? And they're deep in contemplation about that. I had some long discussions with senior leadership about saying, you can't just go back to Kerbala, and you can't say, well, Kerbala is our message, because, you've got to, what does that mean to an 18-year-old boy or girl who's more interested in the shoes she's wearing or the jacket she's got on, and is it the latest design? Because that's what Iran is like as much as China. I mean, every young people today want to wear designer clothes and wear designer shoes. That's fine. It doesn't, you can still find it. And you see, watch the videos, great armadas of young women, guns on their shoulder, marching through with their flag, young children, all. And when President Trump threatened to end their civilization, what happened? They all went out and they stood on the bridges. They stood and sort of made a human shield around their power stations and said, come and get us if you want. We're here. We're ready to sacrifice. I mean, that was, the sense of feeling of that is palpable. You can just see the energy. And our question is, how do we find the way to get that energy back into, I believe, young people today who are frustrated and who have become negative because we live in a nihilistic world at the moment, a nihilistic world dominated by a rather crass materialism. And they want something more. They want to feel, what's the point? Why am I, what is the point of being an Italian? What is the vision of it? What does it mean to be Italian today? What does it mean to be American today? How do we turn that into something that has meaning and purpose.
So one of the ways this is coming to a head in America is, I'm sure you haven't seen the latest statistics. We have one campaign between Congress Thomas Massey and his primary. He's been regularly against the war and the war machine and refused to vote foreign aid for Israel. And he does not take money from AIPAC, but his primary opponent on the Republican side has now gotten $9 million from AIPAC. It's quite extraordinary to watch. And you're seeing an enormous rejection by the young people of the Zionist element in American politics. But but that is coming to a head. We just covered a story on Money and Markets. Israel is upping the propaganda budget in the United States from 150 million to 750 million. And you can see this escalation of the young people rejecting and the Zionists pushing back. And, it has not come to a head yet, but it is clearly on its way. And that's part of rejecting this materialist vision, because in the United States, this is why I love your coverage. We are watching so much of the coverage of the war coming out of the White House is really designed to facilitate the insider trading. It has nothing to do with the conduct of the war. Right.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's just keeping markets elevated at a critical time before midterms, of course. Because all of his team is telling him you've got to sort of transfer and concentrate on, the midterms now and try and, because your approval rating is down in the depths. What happens to Massey is going to be a huge signal.
Right.
It's going to be very tight, as I understand it, very tight indeed, because he's had this huge amount spent against him. But who knows? I think the outcome of that, even if he loses, it has been a signal. The issue has been raised. The flag has gone up. And so I think this is really important. And I think one of the things that needs to be understood and sort of explained and unfolded is, of course, some of the roots to this, because, the roots are not easy to understand. We're dealing with an eschatological problem as much as anything else. It's a way of understanding. Some years ago, I wrote a piece saying there's no point in trying to understand what's happening in the Middle East if you look at it through secular rationalist thinking. You have to understand that there's a messianic and an embrace of Armageddon as the solution to redemption in Israel, amongst a majority of it, however you define it. But most Israelis now support that. It shifted a lot over this period. And so suggesting to Israelis, why don't you restrain your calls for action against Iran, doesn't make sense. Because actually you say, well, it's not in your best interest because you could lose American support if you do that, or you're missing the point. These people, and I've heard Smotrich say this, 7 years ago, he said, to complete our project, Greater Israel, forcing redemption by military seizing of territory, we need a big crisis or a big war. We want a big war.
Right.
So if they're not frightened of Armageddon, in fact, welcome it. You're going there and saying, be careful, it may not be in America and Europe's interest for you to do, to pursue the war against Iran. Well, this is their last chance to try and bring about redemption through a forced outcome. There's an ideological military component to this, and then there is also the sort of messianic eschatological component to this, which is about reaching a redemption of some sort. And you have to understand it. And when I said we are in a war, there is an element understanding that these profound impulses, it's not just economics, not just material, there are other impulses and other structures and interests above the ones that we normally see. And all I'm saying is that you have to see them and you have to understand them, and then one has to work out what is the right way of moving ahead.
So at Conflicts Forum, I always check into your Substack because you will pick out coverage from the Middle East, including Israel, and translate it and provide these excerpts. And you just had one from, I believe he's a military officer, talking about the deterioration of the IDF into barbarism. And I was very struck by a military man saying we can't have a disciplined force if we deteriorate into this form of barbarism. It was very interesting. But you got the feeling of this greater battle that you're talking about.
And these are done, I just quickly say, by Ashley, my wife, we work together. And she does this. I mean, she lived in Israel, as I did, for a number of years, and was at the Hebrew University briefly. So she knows who's who and why they're talking as they talk. This is essential. I mean, you can just read, the Hebrew press, but if you don't know who is pro-Netanyahu, who is against who's on which side, as she does, it doesn't, so she chooses it. And she said to me the other day, every time I do this, people are saying this cannot, we have the head of the defense force saying the military is exploding, it's crashing. He went to the cabinet meeting and said, I want to put up 10 red lights. We can't go on as we're going on. What did he mean? And what he meant was this, that when Israel was first founded, Ben-Gurion said, look, we are a small people on a small territory. And the only way we can manage this is to have a small professional army and rely on reservists. We can't field a big standing army and take on the world. It's not possible. So this is how we have to do it. And Netanyahu broke this pattern after the 7th of October. He bust that and said, no, we're going to take, Syria, we're going to take Lebanon, part of Lebanon, we are going to take the West Bank, and we are going to force the issue of Greater Israel militarily across it, and Iran being the major prize in this, to set an Israeli hegemony across the region. And what these military officers are saying, one way or another, is they're saying, listen, if you wanted to do this, we would need 6 or 7 IDFs, not one, 6 or 7. It's just it's just the whole structure is breaking down. And actually, Ash said to me, then she said, I feel embarrassed because I feel people will start to think that I look for these sort of statements about the morale breakdown in the army and this. And she says, I don't. They just come shouting at me from my reading of this. There is a huge crisis, existential crisis, and it's become more profound because 93% of Israelis expected and wanted, the United States to do the job of destroying Iran, destroying it completely as a functioning state, not just mowing the lawn in Iran, but destroying it. And so these all have been coming out, these statements. Very important. Israel is at a crucial point, and they may disrupt, if you like, what's happening in the Middle East. I would not at all put it past Iran to force a further round of conflict in Iran by a false flag event, or by just extreme pressure on the White House through the big donors and the Israeli link, the Israeli first elements in the United States. So, I mean, that is because Netanyahu is desperate. I mean, the people there are saying to Netanyahu very plainly, and they're saying to him, look, you promised us a great victory. Where is it? It hasn't happened. You achieved none of the goals you wanted in Iran. Nothing has happened. The nuclear program has not been destroyed. The missile program has not been destroyed. There was no uprising in Iran. Even the Israeli intelligence admit it probably was never in prospect. It is not. And so they're saying, in Gaza, you have failed. Look, Hamas is still there. It's still largely controlling Gaza. In Lebanon, you are being defeated. The Hezbollah are using new drones, fiber optic controlled drones. It's devastating the Israelis, and they are fearful that they're going to have to withdraw in humiliation from the south of Lebanon. So all of this, elections are coming up in Israel, and if Netanyahu loses those elections, there is a real possibility that he goes to jail because of the criminal charges against him, and those have not been resolved yet. He hasn't got a pardon from the president, and those charges are still continuing. Whether there will be a solution is possible, but if not, he will have to, because his exemption from prison from the previous charges relies on him being prime minister. If he ceases to be prime minister, then he can be sent to prison. So it's existential for him.
So I think the message is catharsis ahead. Yeah, yeah,
I think, unfortunately, it's baked in. It is
yeah.
baked in now. I mean,
Well,
unfortunately, because it's going to be economically, terrible for us in Europe. I mean, for
yeah,
everyone, but in Europe, it'll be worse than the most. And people are not ready. They haven't been prepared at all. They're sort of continuing, cabaret time goes on, and suddenly the music will stop, and it will be a shock.
yeah, it will be a shock. I live half the year in the Netherlands, but I'm in Pennsylvania. I'm in the States now. I will say this: I just heard 100 high schooler and grade schoolers play Bach last night, so it was very inspiring. And so there is some civilization going on, but you're right. Most people have no idea what's coming. None. It's shocking. Anyway, but Alistair, if we don't know what's coming, it has not because you haven't warned us. And so I cannot thank you enough for your work. You really help us see the full complexity of what's going on in the Middle East. I want to recommend to everyone that they check out Conflicts Forum Substack. It's an invaluable source, and you post many of your interviews there. We'll post this, and I just want to thank you again for your work. Thank you for joining us on the Solari Report. Any last words?
No, just it's been a pleasure to join you tonight.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the Solari Report. Catharsis ahead. Get ready, get ready, get ready.